Hi everybody, and welcome to the seventh in our series of commentaries on the crisis, in which we're intending to bring insight into the way businesses are changing and have changed through the crisis, the stages of that change, how we can recognize those changes and those stages, and how best we can react and work through as the crisis continues. We'll be focusing today mainly on the second stage of crises, which is the replanning and reframing stage, rather than the early reactive and stabilization stage. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Brian Donoghue, who is the Chief People Officer of Marie Curie, and Debbie Coulson, who runs their transformation program and used to run their army of volunteers. So welcome, Brian. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to see you. Marie Curie is an organisation which was set up, I believe, in 1948. So it's exactly the same age as the NHS and sits alongside the NHS.
Yeah.
So a really important service, which no doubt you'll tell us more about in a little while. So just wanted to start with talking a little bit about the structures of the stages. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending and acknowledge the diversity of the attendees. So once again, we have everyone from HRDs to HR team members and people who are actually working on delivering the service. So welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. We're going to try and draw lessons and tips from people at different levels of organisation so that we can all learn from each other. So welcome and thank you. We'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, and I think the box is either at the top or the bottom of your screen, so please type in any questions for Brian and Debbie as we go. And we're trying to cover three things today. One is try and get a firmer grip on the anatomy of the crisis, the stages which we're moving through and how they're affecting different businesses. So some real practical examples about how this has impacted, in this case, one of the largest charities in the UK. And then draw lessons from these experiences to better equip ourselves to understand and react better within our businesses. I mean, I always start with a note at this point, which is to say that we're not focusing on the personal psychology aspect of the crisis, we're focusing on the business psychology aspect. The reason for that is that none of us are really qualified to talk in that area, and so actually it's understanding how businesses are reacting and how they're going through their life cycle, which we're focusing on. So to start, this pandemic, make no mistake, is the largest health crisis of any of us have seen in our lifetimes, and also the largest business crisis. And so understanding its anatomy is more important than ever. Crises, however, follow a certain pattern, and we've been discussing this pattern right from the start of the pandemic, which starts with a kind of reactive and stabilization stage. And that stage is one which, thankfully, many of our businesses have now passed, but was extremely challenging for all of us. Followed by a replanning and reframing stage in which we start to get to grips with the new reality, which is going to follow beyond that, which is the new business conditions for all of us. And I can't imagine there's a business in the world who don't believe that the future is likely to be radically different from what we experienced, what seems like a different world away, which is 12 weeks ago. So in order, I'd like to start with the reactive stage and really think back actually to what that was like and draw on Brian and Debbie's reflections on that. So Brian, can you take us through what the impact and experience was for Marie Curie and how that manifested itself?
Sure. So I guess for people who aren't really familiar with Marie Curie is a charity that provides palliative care for people who are at the end of their life and support for their families and loved ones. And I guess as a charity that provides hands-on care, we're slightly different to a number of other charities that either just raise funds and invest that in research or grant giving or whatever that might be. So I guess when the COVID-19 crisis, I guess, started to kick in, there were four real main areas of the charity that were affected in very different ways. So our caring services, which is our hospices and our community-based nursing services continue to have a frontline role in caring for people who were and are at end of life, but just with the added complexity that a number of patients who we started seeing also were patients who had or developed COVID-19 as well as their other kind of comorbidities. So our nursing staff had to deal with kind of different levels of protection and maintaining safety and providing care that they weren't used to. But those services continued, as I say. Then in other areas, we had retail. So we've got 175 retail stores across the 4 nations. And as soon as the social distancing regulations and guidance came in, we clearly shut those as quickly as we could. And all of the people affected were in effect put into furlough before people even really knew what furlough meant and what it was about. So we had to come up with new policies and processes around that, which our HR team did kind of fantastic role in delivering that really quickly. And then you've got the office-based staff, so all of the people who are based in places like our offices in London or up in Link's Place in Edinburgh, or kind of scattered around the country in various offices, and we've got something like 88 different office bases. All of those people had to be moved to home working pretty much overnight, as we said at the beginning. We shifted from being office-based to home-based on the night of the 16th of March, and that happened really quickly. And I guess some of our infrastructure and things that we had in place supported us being able to do that fairly quickly. So that was successful, I believe. And then fundraising, the last one, but in no means the least, was absolutely decimated, I guess, because we were right in the middle of the Great Daffodil Appeal, which is Marie Curie's largest and single most important fundraising event of the year. And we basically just had to stop it dead in its tracks because we couldn't have our kind of store-based collections or street-based collections where you'd see our volunteers and staff out in their yellow garb collecting on a daily basis through the month of March. So that had a serious impact on our ability to fundraise, but also all of the other kind of general fundraising, kind of community-based activities that would be going on, a lot of the mass participation events that we would normally take part in. All of that pretty much stopped dead in its tracks. So our ability to fundraise was hugely kind of compromised. And Marie Curie is an organization where we're kind of 4,300 staff and about 10,000 volunteers. It costs us about, or we need to raise about £2.5 million a day, sorry, a week. Day would be great. A week to run the organization. So that inability to fundraise has a huge impact on potential in terms of what we do going forward and how we survive as an organization. So we had to take some immediate decisions in terms of how we could reduce costs. Part of that was furlough. So we initially furloughed all of the retail staff. That was about 430 people that we furloughed in that kind of first week when it was available. And as I said, that was something that was entirely new. So we had to develop processes and policies around that and communications that would support it. And in the following weeks, we then started looking at other areas that we could furlough people. So across retail, across some of the corporate functions, some of the support functions. And eventually we've got to a position where we furloughed about 880 staff, I think is the current number. And then the other kind of things that we did was kind of stopping some of the major projects that were scheduled to go on this year. So all of those kind of things were called to a halt or put in the fridge, as some of our exec call it, and a decision to just not spend any money in those kind of things, with a couple of notable exceptions, and Debbie will speak to them a little bit later. That includes our back office. Yeah.
It strikes me that Marie Curie was in a very interesting position because out of the 4 areas you described, 3 of them are really kind of frontline right at the front of the crisis type impacts. The kind of, most businesses we talk to may have been impacted in one or two ways, but the fact that you are offering palliative care into large numbers of people, so you're actually providing nursing and other support. Then the fact that you're doing retail, which had to close down immediately, and then the third thing, the massive drop in funding. Those three alone, the breadth of the impact on you guys must have been enormous, and I think that makes your experience really interesting. I wonder, Debbie, how did you? What sort of? There must have been a decision-making process about what continues and what doesn't continue. How did you come to that, and what have you continued with, and what's kind of taken put in the fridge, as Brian said?
Put in the fridge. It's a great phrase, that one. What I would say was that none of those decisions were easy for the executive and for our senior leadership team, because the organisation pre to this pandemic was absolutely moving towards a new strategic window, and we had this new North Star, which was this really exciting new vision that we were all mobilising ourselves to work towards. And then this happened, and that kind of suddenly you're in a position where you have to stop and you have to think about all that exciting stuff that was going to happen, and the future that we had planned for Marie Curie. So none of the decisions were easy for the executive. I think they very quickly met and talked about everything that happens across Marie Curie. So all of our operational stuff and how we manage in the way that Brian's just told you, the impact on that, but also the change work that was happening. And up until the point that this pandemic started, the charity was managing multiple change programs, similar to many other organisations. Some smaller ones, so small improvements, some new stuff, so new services and new fundraising and new ways of working, and then two relatively large transformation programs that were running in our caring services area, which was called the nursing systems transformation. So that was about moving our caring services systems onto kind of best of breed platforms to ensure that we're providing the right service for our staff, but mainly that we are giving our patients the right service and they're getting the right skills and support that they need from our staff. And then the back office transformation program, which was shortened to BOT, which, fortunate, unfortunate, we're not really sure about that title at the moment. But the back office transformation program, which is the one that I'm a part of, which was really about making sure that our back office functions are able to underpin and support the organisation the way we want them to. So those two change programs are not small investments. And I think probably that some of the criteria that our executive had to consider when they were thinking about whether they carry those on or not has to be based around the kind of time and effort and investment that has already gone into getting those programs up and running. So these weren't kind of ideas that were there that we thought, well, we'll carry that idea on. These were programs that have been in flight for a number of months, years for NST already. So that had to be a part of it. What you can't do is just ignore the investment that had already gone in. But equally, we needed to demonstrate that we had strong and ambitious plans to fulfill those change programs and to complete those change programs in the timescales that we said we would do them in. So there's something about what's already gone in, what's the kind of future for those plans, are they on track, are they delivering in the way we want them to deliver, and will they deliver on time and to budget. But there's also some kind of decision making around and a criteria around understanding the impact of those programs on the organisation as we work through the pandemic, but also the next step for Marie Curie. So what is the world post-COVID for Marie Curie, and what role would these change programs play in that? And it was quite clear very quickly that both of those big ones, particularly the back office transformation, play a really important role in moving the organisation forward. And I think probably that was that kind of clinching factor that without these we can't move forward.
I think that's very interesting, Debbie. I think that a lot of organisations, people, when we think about technology 10, 20 years ago, we think, it was kind of like, oh, that would be a good thing to do, or all that stuff. But I think that the COVID crisis, from a lot of the people we've spoken to, has revealed that actually it's kind of the essential plumbing to keep a business and understand a business. And so actually it's, they've been seeing brought into stark relief that where their plumbing is not in condition to give them the information they need, etc. And actually, in some cases, the kind of desire to get on with and fix that stuff has become, or the need to, has become more clear rather than less clear.
Absolutely, and not just that kind of the need for it. I mean, if we look back now and we reflect on the 16th of March, whenever it was, when Marie Curie went into the kind of home working bit and we started having to make these decisions, probably the senior leadership that were making those decisions, one of the things that they needed desperately at that point was data, good information. And we had to work incredibly hard across many functions to provide them with that, to make the right decisions and the right insight. So actually, that need for technology, we needed it then. And so we need to make sure we keep moving ahead to be in the right position as we go forward. The other thing that this has done for us, I think it's fair to say probably when we first started pitching this transformation over a year and a half ago to the organisation, we were we thought we were being super ambitious with what we wanted for the charity. And we were like, we're going to move people onto self-service and it's going to be great. And all these staff are going to have an app on their phone. And lots of the reaction at the time was, oh, are we ready? Are we ready for that? Are we sure? Can the organisation take that? And what we've proved in the last 12 weeks is they can take that and some more. So maybe we need to be more ambitious with what we're offering, because our staff have adapted incredibly well with very little challenge and concern. They have just taken what we've given them. They've taken our advice. They've used their initiative. They've committed and shown us loyalty to the charity in a way we just had never seen before. And they've taken to an agile way of working in a wonderful way. So I think probably this has opened a door in some way for us to be able to maybe push our transformations even a bit harder than we were before.
It's very interesting because I was reflecting the other day, and we hadn't really heard this quote much, but one of Winston Churchill's quotes was, "Never waste a good crisis." Now, although it's kind of slightly jocular to mention that, I think that actually there's something really there, which is that a lot of businesses have seen their business and their team members react and adapt their ways of working in ways in which we believed would have taken years and years and years to achieve. I mean, if you took the simple example of the different way doctors are doing consultations now, through computers, etc., that's years and years of transformation in a few weeks. And I wonder how much the barriers to doing that previously were real and how much they were kind of perceived. I don't know what you think, Brian. I mean, in retrospect, when we were all cautious about what our team members could achieve, do you feel we were overcautious in retrospect?
I think we were, but I guess everybody's perception about what is the right thing to do has shifted during this crisis. I think if you spoke to, I guess, a big chunk of our organization prior to this crisis, that we're thinking about redeploying you shortly just into a totally different role and a totally different directorate, doing a job you've never done before. But we think it'd be a good idea because you've got some really good capabilities. People would just go, my God, there's no chance. So you've got to consult with me, you've got to go through a major process, and even then I won't be happy with it. Whereas we've gone through this crisis and people have flipped at the drop of a hat into totally different roles, doing things that they would have been uncomfortable with and perhaps unsure about, and have done fantastic jobs in them. And they've just kind of thrown themselves into these things with gusto. And actually it does tell us a lot about, I suppose, individual people's capabilities in the roles that they do that actually are transferable across different areas. So I think part of it is perhaps, that we were not ambitious enough in the past, but part of it, I think, is just about being realistic about the things that people can do and do, and how those can be used in different ways. And it's areas like that, I think, that has shifted our thinking quite a lot in the last 12 weeks or so.
Mm-hmm. And I think we should move on to that, actually, the kind of shift in thinking and what we're going to continue, because many of we started these events, this is, as I said, the 7th, and I think we started them at least 2 months ago, and we've been doing them almost weekly. And at the early stage, everyone was in a reactive stage, and then trying to stabilize their business and keep things going, keep the lights on. But increasingly, last few weeks, thank goodness, we're hearing about organisations making their transition into what is the next phase, which is kind of replanning and reframing their thoughts for the new reality which is going to appear. And I don't think anyone thinks that the new reality when we do get out of this crisis is going to be the same as or anything other than radically different from what we've seen before. So I was wondering, Brian, if you could tell us when that happened in your case, moving from full focus on stabilization, etc., into starting to think about replanning, and what are your initial reflections on what's going to change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it probably happened at different times in different parts of our organization. So I mentioned at the beginning around the kind of the immediate impact on fundraising. So actually, our fundraising teams had to start thinking immediately about planning for the future, because the kind of revenue streams were drying up, and we had to think about new ways, new different kind of initiatives to try and drive some fundraising. So they got into that kind of planning phase pretty much immediately. In different areas, it probably is different timing, because I guess we were uncertain about what the future would bring in areas like retail and the impact on social distancing and how long that would have across all areas. So whether that's kind of going back into offices and things like that. But I guess in the last few weeks, we've started thinking a bit more long term about actually what is it that we need as an organization to operate. So when you think about things like offices, for example, everybody has made this shift into home working, and it's far more normal to people now. It feels that actually this is something that's doable, and people who would previously had a 1.5 hour kind of commute into the office will be thinking, well, why am I wasting that time coming into an office when actually I've been operating just as effectively, if not more productively, at home than I would be in the office? So it's starting to force us into a rethink about the way our organization is shaped and how we operate. We were already, I guess, Debbie mentioned our North Star and our change in strategy earlier on, and we were already starting to think as an organization how we can become more agile and how we can change the shape of our organization going forward. But this has kind of, again, pushed us to be a bit more ambitious about the way we think about that. How can we decentralize some of our functions and our management structure so that actually you can start creating much more place-based activity? How can you start thinking about actually not having these kind of huge office spaces where people come in and just there's noise and people aren't necessarily always productive? So it started us thinking about that, and I guess that thinking has seriously started happening in the last couple of weeks as we start planning, I suppose, for the rest of this year. And at the same time kind of thinking about, well, actually we've got a business as usual type of operations run as well. So how do we keep the wheels turning and start thinking about that future planning as we get into the year and start thinking about relaxation of the rules and things like that around social distancing?
Brilliant. Debbie, you previous to your role leading the transformation, you led the Army of Volunteers and were part of that team. So I'm really interested in your reflections on how the North Star is changing and what your thoughts are about what's going to be different.
I've still got the battle scars from my head of volunteering role from that army. No, I mean, I think I have to say that having now been fully immersed in the world of volunteer management and human resource management, I maintain that volunteer management is one of the hardest people management careers to work in. Maybe slightly controversial, but it's a really interesting world because, I mean, take Marie Curie's model as an example. We've got about 10,000 people. There are no contracts. There are kind of role descriptions. We've got them on our database. We know who they are. We know which member of staff is kind of, vaguely responsible for them. But without those 10,000 people and the mobilization of that model, we just wouldn't operate. We would stop just overnight. That's how important they are to us. And I think that has been proven in the last 12 weeks in such a significant way. I mean, we've talked before about the fact that One of the challenges of the volunteer workforce during this pandemic was that kind of generally most national charities find their volunteer workforces are made up of predominantly people who have retired, and that's because that's where you get the most time that can be given. Mm-hmm. So where you've got kind of really regular, consistent weekly roles like a shop volunteer or a befriender or somebody who's driving in our hospices, driving patients around or something, you need that kind of commitment. So you tend to go to that age group because they can give you that time. But obviously at the moment, we now have this kind of secondary responsibility for their welfare and to make sure that, we have a duty of care to them in some respects. So the pandemic has kind of impacted our volunteer program in one way, because we need to make sure we're careful for those people, that if they're isolating, we're supporting that we're giving welfare calls, we're checking they're all right and okay, if they've got everything that they need. But obviously that has an impact on our operations. So from a volunteering workforce point of view, very much the future in the North Star is about us understanding who will return, which of our kind of current volunteer roles, and we've got quite a few hundred of them that the 10,000 volunteers slot into, which of them are future proof, which of them are realistic for the future, and which ones do we need to rethink or change or remove. And I think there's a real responsibility now on our volunteering experts within Marie Curie to be more innovative and creative around how we engage and involve volunteers going forward. I mean, we've already seen some of that happening. So as with many organisations that do care in the way we do, NHS included, we've had challenges with PPE and sourcing PPE and then getting it to both our hospices, but also our community nurses who support people in their homes overnight. So we've had a challenge getting that PPE in, and immediately our army of volunteers stepped up to that challenge, and we've now got this incredible distribution programme that, DHL and Yodel would be proud of, where we have this PPE being delivered to one of our hospices and this whole bunch of amazing volunteer drivers go in their vans and they pick it up and they distribute it around the country, and then a whole nother network of volunteers pick it up from another hub and they deliver it to people's houses and to nurses' houses, so they've got that PPE, and that happens every week, and that's volunteers that just stepped up into that. And I think it's testament to the organisation that we've got that workforce, that we were able to adapt that quickly. So we talked about being more agile and that being very important in the North Star, but again, we're proving that we can do that. But also that our volunteering and our HR teams, our back office teams, were able to flex and react to ensure we could get volunteers in, checked in time to do that.
And presumably, Debbie, this was a role and a skill set to collect PPE and distribute it, etc., which didn't exist and was not something you'd even thought about pre.
No, not really. No, and I think, the PPE challenges, you could do a whole webinar on that in itself, I think. And that's, Brian talked earlier about people suddenly having to redeploy into other teams. And we've seen that across the organisation. So people have redeployed to my team to support the transformation. But probably one of the most interesting examples of that is that our strategy team was suddenly responsible with sourcing the PPE. So, they've gone from the people that are creating the future and supporting senior managers to write a strategy to, we need quite a few thousand face masks tomorrow. So you guys need to crack on with that. And suddenly this team, and they just took to it, they adapted to it. And it's a really great example of how people can use their skill sets in different ways. And then obviously our volunteering team step up to the plate and get the right people in there at the right time. And it kind of just cascades from there.
So Debbie, do you have any, because I think it's really interesting describing how, and we've seen it across industries, how people have stepped up to the mark, done different roles, really transformed the way they work, and done things which they did not believe they could do 12 weeks ago, and done it with ease and with enthusiasm, and etc. How do you think one can kind of retain those really inspirational parts of the crisis and kind of build on them in the next stage? Do you think that's possible? Or are we all going to go back to the way we were?
I don't think that's not an option, is it, really? I think it has to be possible. We have to make it possible. I think it's absolutely one of the areas that Marie Curie need to grab hold of and not let go of. We talk a lot at Marie Curie about our culture and the different elements that make up our culture. And one of the things we've always talked about is how do we break down the silos between the different parts of the organisation And overnight that happened. It had to happen. So, you know, we had fundraisers driving care packages to patients. We had people in the people team delivering PPE to nurses, all sorts of different things happening, people going over and above, but people stretching themselves and their skill sets. And that is one of those steps, I believe, towards that change of culture that we want to see. So kind of our challenge now is to grasp hold of that. We're doing a lot of work around kind of really putting a spotlight on those stories and on those people and on those moments, if you like, that inspire the organisation. But I think there's probably a responsibility for the people team to now go, okay, how do we keep this happening? So it shouldn't just be because there's a pandemic going on that we've got people doing different things. How do we keep that rolling? And that's part of that whole, the kind of Marie Curie family community aspect that I think is something that as a strategic people team we've been looking at and trying to tap into for a while. And so, I mean, I think it's a mixture of comms, it's a mixture of making sure there are opportunities for people, it's a mixture of ensuring that people are recognised and acknowledged and celebrated so they feel confident and that they inspire other staff and volunteers to do the same thing.
I think it's very interesting, and Brian, I'm going to draw you back in on this, but you know, HR, people leadership has been, you know, if we look back on it, we've been quite risk averse. We've clearly, you know, underestimated what our people can do, and kind of taken a cautious view of that. So, you know, a lot of our rules and controls were about ensuring that we weren't challenging some people with something which everyone couldn't do. But now we're seeing that actually, you know, the potential in our businesses is much greater than we expected. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how we might change that so that we're taking a more positive and kind of skills and capability based view of our teams.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we have been discussing, the shift, I suppose, or I guess the importance of critical skills versus critical roles. So I think if we looked at our organization as little as kind of 3 months ago, you'd kind of say we've got all of these kind of siloed areas of the business with people with particular skills and a really strong emphasis on kind of people with great deal of subject matter expertise. And we kind of, I think probably put people with a very specific niche kind of understanding and expertise around particular areas and saw them as really important. As we've gone through this crisis, I think we've seen actually that there's far more benefit through this kind of process and an event with people who've got a more generalist kind of view and ability, and actually some of the critical skills that they have are more important than the roles necessarily that they would have done. So we are starting to think about actually how do we separate skills from, I guess, roles and start thinking about how you can use people in a much more agile way. And I guess lots of kind of IT companies and kind of project-based companies will have had this kind of approach already or previously, but you're kind of looking at how do we kind of look at what we need to do at any particular time. So whether it's a project, whether it's a new business development, whether it's a new kind of way of working, and look at the people who can support that best, not necessarily the roles that would generally kind of in the past we kind of say, oh, we need somebody from HR, we need somebody from volunteering, we need somebody from finance, and we need somebody from caring services. Start thinking about actually what are the skills and capabilities that we need to make this deliverable, and start looking across our organization about who's got them and try and have a more diverse and a broad church of people involved in those things. And I suppose moving towards kind of almost an internal gig kind of economy of resourcing activities and projects. But to do that really well, actually, we need better data, we need better kind of information, and that's really where I guess the importance of maintaining that focus on the back office transformation and the systems that we're putting in. I think the exec have seen that actually without that kind of infrastructure and capability, then we can't really harness all of the kind of skills and capabilities of our very broad kind of range of people, including volunteers. So as Debbie said earlier, we've got 10,000 volunteers, but we know very little about them in terms of their capability and their willingness to do different things. And people might come in to do one thing, so well, that's kind of work in a shop or supporting a hospice a day a week or whatever, but they come with a huge kind of history and background and range of skills. And once they become involved in the charity, there might be other things they want to do and add their skills to. So actually having this much better information and data will enable us to kind of tap into a range of capabilities and skills in a way that we've never been able to do before.
I mean, it is really interesting, isn't it? I kind of am rather taken with, I mean, I know that amongst the volunteer force, Debbie, that there's people with enormous skills and experience. But what I think is interesting about the crisis is that we've been, rather than directing our teams and our people to do things and pulling them together in a team, it's been more of a sharing of a problem and then allowing them to then say, right, well, I can do that bit and I can do this bit. And I think that's a very different philosophy of business organization. I wonder what you think of that, but I think it is very interesting. We've seen leadership from the bottom. I can do that, so I'll do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really kind of pure bottom-up approach, isn't it, that we've seen, and probably charities tend to be, maybe it's easier for them to transition to that type of a model because we've always involved volunteers. I mean, if you think about our governance structure, our board of trustees, our top board, they're all volunteers. So we've always been led by a group of people that are particularly passionate about the cause that we're here to address. I think the fact that volunteers have always been able to say, this is me, this is what I can do, how can I help you? And probably in the past, volunteering programs have been quite traditional and quite rigid and quite structured, and that hasn't helped that type of an approach. But actually one thing we've learned is we need to relax all of that to be able to adapt and flex and do what we need to do in that moment, at that time, in that place, for that group of people or person that we're trying to help. And certainly I think some of that has probably rubbed off on our staff. So definitely we've had people putting their hand up saying, this is me, this is where I am, what can I do, can I help? Can I drive stuff around? Can I do some fundraising? Can I support in some way? Did you know I'm actually really good at this specific niche skill that you maybe didn't know before? And what can I do with that to help you? And probably we've seen more staff doing that than we have done before. And certainly I would echo what Brian was saying about the need for good data. And one of the things that perhaps has become a bigger focus in the back office transformation than it was before was that skills and experience piece. So we need to make sure that we give staff and volunteers the opportunity, if they want, to tell us what they're good at outside of their day job, so we can mobilize that and use it. And we just haven't done that before. And so that has definitely become a bigger priority, I think, than it was before.
I think it's very interesting, and this is my big takeaway of the conversations I've been having with HRDs since people have started thinking about replanning, and it is that leadership for so many years has been, here's a problem, I'm going to analyze that problem and then tell you what you need to do and then fit people within that. And kind of there's a potential and there's a real need to reverse that and expose that, what the business challenges are to our teams, to allow them to tell us how they can support. And I think if we're able as organizations to kind of grasp some of that and deploy that in the future and keep that spirit going, we're going to be such stronger businesses when we finally come out. I mean, a very wise guy said to me the other day, he's a senior HRD, and he was saying that in his experience, 2008 was a kind of FD's crisis, and this one is an HR director's crisis. And I think the way we react to this is really important, and it's on us as HR professionals to see a way through this and see what the new North Star will be for our businesses. So it's really exciting talking to you both. Great insights. Now, Becky, Have we got any questions from the audience which we can now move on to?
Yes, thank you, Brian and Debbie. I've got a question from Nigel. He said, during this crisis, people have been willing to take on other roles and to be more agile. But to what extent is this due to the special circumstances we are in? Is this the new reality, or will people slide back into their traditional silos? Great question, Nigel.
Great question.
I mean, I think probably one of the reasons why people haven't been able to make the shift previously is an issue of capacity and focus, I guess. And kind of COVID-19 just threw everything out the window, and people had to totally rethink how they were approaching things. Whether we can hold on to that going forward is I guess, in the it's in the hands of management and senior leadership to decide how you can nurture that and how you can give people the capacity and freedom to be able to do those kind of things. I think part of it is potentially going to be structural. So we talk about kind of pushing leadership out towards local places within our organization, and how we can move the kind of center of thinking away from the traditional center and push it back out to people. HR has been talking about kind of the concept, I suppose, that the best ideas come from the people that do the job for decades, but has never really been able to do anything about it. And I think this crisis has shown that actually there's a huge truth in that people at the coal face really do know the organization best and have the ability to make some really good decisions. So I think it is about kind of how do we harness that, how do we create the structures and the environment so that people can do that, and the culture. And I guess the way that we're thinking about doing that is about thinking about creating teams that are locally focused, that have some degree of autonomy, but you need to have really good controls and measures to make sure that you don't kind of create chaos, that you kind of do that in a structured and careful way. So you've got a framework that allows people a certain degree of autonomy to make decisions in a local area, but based on people from a variety of different kind of skill sets and areas and backgrounds and things like that. And that's not going to be easy. But I say it's within the gift, I think, of leadership to create the environment where that can happen, and not try to just grab all of the power and responsibility back for themselves. Recognize where the decisions can be best made, and co-create, I guess, the best ideas and the kind of decisions that the organization needs to take.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, and I think maybe we haven't focused enough on this in the things that we've said so far, is the importance of really good open leadership in all of this. And I think there's no doubt that our executive team, led by our CEO, who's just over a year in post now with us, so you know, he was really kind of only finding his feet when this happened, have what they've demonstrated and what they've shown us and what they are in the way that they're behaving. They're open and they're accessible and they listen and they genuinely acknowledge and recognize and will champion everyone, you know, in the whole organization. And I think that has been really important, because that's almost like that door open, that permission to the organization to tell us what you think, to give us your ideas. And it's still not perfect, and there's still a long way for us to go, because you're always going to get some people that will say, oh no, you won't listen to me, or my idea is not good enough, or I might get in trouble if I say the wrong thing, or all those different insecurities that are within people. But actually the really important part of the role modeling and the open leadership that our executive and our chief executive particularly is demonstrating has been essential, I think, in the last 12 weeks, definitely.
That's very good news. That's great. So yes, how critical leadership is in this. So Becky, any more questions?
One more. Yeah, I've got one more, which is a really good one that I want to feed in. So this is from John. Ari, the discussion touched on the non-job skills and capability of the worker and volunteer population. How do you think you will identify, store and manipulate the breadth that those talent elements not normally managed via the more traditional job-focused approach?
Mm-hmm.
They're really giving you easy questions.
Yeah. Do you want to pitch
For
on
a
that first,
start,
maybe, because it's yeah, kind of volunteering and our systems, I guess, is the main focus.
Yeah. So I think safe to say we haven't been great at that before up until now, and I think that's that's probably an okay thing, a fair thing for me to say. The traditional volunteer model in any charity, and it was the same in Marie Curie, is that we recruit somebody and we find out their skill set and we pop them in their box and they stay in their box and they do that role for us. Thanks very much. And it's wonderful and it's amazing, but that's how it's been managed, and that's because of the sheer scale and volume of the number of people that are often involved in these programs. Slightly different for staff, but that's certainly been the way that we've kind of always looked at it. And I think what this has done is said to us that that's not okay anymore, and we can't do that anymore, and we need to be more flexible. We need to be able to respond. We need to know and understand our people in a way we haven't done before. We certainly haven't all got all the answers right now, but one thing we have been able to do is use the back office transformation, and in particular the system implementation part of that, to ensure that as we move forward we have got the tools for our staff and our volunteers to tell us who they are and what they're about and what their skills are and what their hobbies are, up to a point that they're comfortable. And using that information, that data, in a way that can then help us to drive forward some of this stuff as we move forward. So we, as an example, one of the big things that will come through the back office transformation is that we will be empowering volunteers to have self-service, to have their own dashboard in the same way that staff do, to have an about me profile, which might, and I know these things will feel like very simple things that probably you're all sat there thinking we should have done that years ago. Actually, that's just not something that was ever open to volunteers. The cultural change to move our volunteers to a position where they see themselves as a meaningful, equal part of our workforce is a huge step forward, and it's those kind of tools that will help us to start to understand that information about our people. The other thing that we haven't mentioned our internal comms team, but they have played an absolute blinder in the last 12 weeks, and they've done an incredible job, as many internal comms teams will have done. But there is something about those two-way communication channels and that loop that has definitely come to the forefront as something we need to focus on, and it's definitely a priority of theirs to make sure that we are able to communicate out, but we can listen and stuff's coming in, and that those two routes are equal. It's not that the stuff that's coming out to the staff and volunteers is more important than what's coming in. So establishing that kind of real equality between our two areas of feedback is important in that as well, I think.
Yes, if I were to chip in on that, I think the idea of, in some way, establishing a dialogue, a stronger dialogue with our team members and broader team members, is somewhere in there sits the answer. How that is managed and how that is brought about, I think, is more complicated. But I think that that dialogue of allowing people to put forward their skills, etc., is fascinating. Becky, any more questions for today?
No, that's it for today.
Great. Well, look, I'd like to thank Brian and Debbie for speaking today, and for everyone else for attending. So Brian, thank you very much.
Welcome.
And Debbie too. I mean, one thing I'd like to say about Marie Curie is that Marie Curie's work continues. It is critical work which must continue and is frontline work. Obviously, there's funding challenges and fundraising challenges, etc. But you guys have moved most of that online, I believe, and it's available to us all to support the great work you and the volunteers and the rest of the team are doing. So, thank you very much, and it is amazing what that team is doing. We are all incredibly grateful in this very difficult time. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Good to talk to you.
Brilliant, and we'll be continuing a series of webinars as usual on reframing and also the anatomy of the crisis over the future weeks. So, really excited to see you all today. Thank you all for coming.